Good. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Unleash Opportunity webinar. My name is Stuart Newman. I'm a Senior Legal Advisor on Trade and Customs for Amfori. And today we will have the webinar Trade Preferences with Purpose. You have all received the agenda, so I won't introduce all of the participants today. But I will start straight away with Walter van Hattem from the EU Commission. He will speak a little bit about the GSP system per se and give some experience of visits that he has had there. So please, over to you, Walter.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, my camera is not working, so you have to do without my picture, but I think that's better for everybody anyhow. A few words. Naomi, if you can do the next slide, please. I brought a few photos just to illustrate a little bit what we are doing. But the first point I wanted to make is that our EU GSP we consider is effective on two accounts. One is the economics of it, and second is the purpose part of it, which today's meeting is about. If we go to the next one, please. Well, just a picture from Mongolia. The previous one was Sri Lanka, but I would say on the economics of it, there's a couple of elements that GSP brings to the beneficiary countries, some of them being the poorest in the world. One is you add value to the local economies, creating jobs. We have figures, for instance, Bangladesh, roughly 5 million people depend on the preferences. Slightly less in countries like Myanmar and the Philippines, but still roughly 500 or 200,000 per country. If you then go to the next slide, what we also see is that actually the relevance of GSP is increasing over the years. So here you see on the left-hand scale the increase of GSP imports into the EU, roughly 74 billion euros last year. And on the right-hand side, you see actually our imports from the world overall. And so you see proportionately, actually the imports from GSP countries are increasing faster than our imports from the world. If we then go to the next one, you can also see this is on the left-hand scale, the imports per beneficiary country. We have today 71 countries benefiting from GSP. And last year, we roughly imported 1 billion euros per country on the average. So it's quite a steep increase. And what you also see is that the utilization rate, which is defined as how much these countries are able to actually use the preferences, is also increasing. It was 84.4% last year. Now, if we go to the next one. Sorry if I go too fast, but anyhow. The next one actually shows, and I won't show this too long, but it's an indication that some countries are increasing their preference quite a lot more. We have good imports increases from countries like South Sudan, Kyrgyzstan, Mauritania, and Myanmar, among the poorest. What you see is that the EU is importing more than double in terms of imports from LDCs than the rest of the world does. But what you also see here in the right column is that the impact of COVID-19 is quite dramatic for countries like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Ethiopia. So that's something that needs to be considered also in response, GSP being a response to the COVID-19. Now, the next one. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. Riding with a purpose. Now, these GSP preferences do not come for free, as we say. We actually expect countries to at least kind of implement human and labor rights provisions of conventions. And with a selected few countries, we also ask for commitments on environment and good governance. Now, just to give you a few examples how we do that. Next slide, please. In a country like Mongolia, we actually support the environmental agenda. One of the most polluted, if not the most polluted cities in the world is Ulaanbaatar. And actually we use GSP Plus to also reform some of the kind of energy supply in the country. But there's more to that. In Mongolia, we also included a child labor survey and ratification of child labor conventions as part of our discussions. Next slide. In a country like more complicated country. Next one, please, Naomi. Okay, I'm not sure, I don't see it, but I hope you see it. But next one is Myanmar, also a good example where we try actually to advocate, for instance, for labor rights. And where you see that, for instance, the country just ratified ILO Convention 138 on minimum age following strong pressure from the EU. I will get back to it because there's a lot more to that country than you can imagine. I also put up on the previous slide some of the M40 standards, which, for instance, were quite well taken in factories in Sri Lanka, where I visited a carbon neutral garment factory. Very interesting. Pakistan, more challenging. But we do achieve certain things. They adopted a transgender bill. They adopted a bill to protect children's rights. Again, there's a lot more to ask for, but still. Next one, please. I realize I go a bit fast. Sorry for that. Carry on. I mean, we say GSP is effective. That doesn't mean there's not more we can do. And actually, we try to do a lot more. And hopefully also with you and people who are following us in the audience. If we go to the next one, there's a number of elements where you can go further. One element is that all the imports under GSP are very much skewed towards textiles and clothing. And arguably GSP provides a lot more for the countries to look into. So one of the challenges is to help further with export diversification to take advantage of some of the other sectors. The next one, please. For this, we need to address bottlenecks. We work a lot closely with colleagues from our development aid programs to see how we can help countries to meet standards. And then the next one, also to invest in building skills so that they can actually add value. This picture is in the Philippines, where going from a cacao exporting country, they want to actually bring more chocolate production into the country. Now for that, we try to support colleagues with building the necessary skill sets as well. The next one. This is a very important one, engage industry. Because I only think you can be successful if you actually bring in European investors into these countries. We see a very good kind of take up, especially on the labor side, but also, for instance, on environmental standards. So European industry can be at the forefront of this purposeful trading. It also means these things are not done in isolation, with integrated supply chains. Countries, beneficiary countries, I would argue, do not have much choice anymore to actually increase the standards and the values. Next one, please. And then I come to the end of my short intervention, but in terms of riding further, I say GSP is effective. That doesn't mean we can solve all the issues. And I give you a few examples where we actually, as an EU, struggle together with you to see if we can make further progress. If you look at the next one, just a few examples. It's anecdotal, but still extremely important. The war on drugs in the Philippines. Can you deal with that in the context of GSP preference? What we were able to do so far is to advocate against the reintroduction of the death penalty, arguing that this would go against one of the conventions that the Philippines signed up with. But how far does our trade instrument reach on issues which are so serious as the war on drugs? But we have similar advocacies going on in Myanmar. The Rohingya crisis, can you actually resolve it by trade alone? Very complicated issues. But for instance, on the other hand, in Armenia, they agreed to abolish the death penalty, part of the GSP Plus discussion. Another very difficult issue, trade, labor issues. It's true that we are able to make progress, but often we are being asked to look into individual kind of labor disputes. And that's obviously not something where our trade instruments is the best one geared towards. I'm just giving you the limits of what we can bring. My last slide, and this is basically at the request of Stuart, so I put it in there. I don't know if you can see it, the final slide. I don't see it. Oh, there it is. I mean, basically just a no-brainer, but at least for me working on this issue, but we consider that doing trade policy cannot go without actually doing this purpose agenda and supporting the sustainable development countries, even if extremely complicated. This picture was taken in one of the IDP camps in Myanmar, where the situation is really horrible, but where still, nevertheless, we try to contribute with our trade agenda towards an improvement of the situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Walter, for that brief introduction to GSP, and we know where to come if we ever need your footballing skills. I'd now like to hand over to Bernd Schaefer. He is a customs expert in Metro. Metro are one of our largest members, and they do a lot of sourcing from GSP countries and countries with which the EU has a FTA. And over to you, Bernd.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart, for the introduction. And of course, thank you very much, Walter, for the very impressive presentation. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for the invitation and a warm welcome to all attendees. My name is Bernd Schaefer, and I have been working as a customs expert for Metro since 2010. For me, it is a great pleasure to show you today's topic, trade preferences, from the perspective of an importing company. At the beginning, a few words about Metro. Metro is a leading international specialist in food and non-food wholesale. In its core business of wholesale, Metro Wholesale is active worldwide with 678 stores in 24 countries. In addition, Metro Wholesale is also active in other 10 countries with its food service distribution business. The delivery business includes Metro Delivery Service and the delivery specialists Classic Fine Food, Proa Pro, and Rongi Express. At present, Metro is located in 15 of the current 27 EU member states. Especially in the non-food sector, we import a lot of different products, for example, textiles and garments, as well as hard goods like deep fryers, pots and pans, and all other products our main customers, that include restaurants, caterers, and hotels, ask for. Most of these products originate in the Far East. Of course, we import a lot of products from China. The quality of the goods, as well as the good business relations having been in existence with the suppliers in China for many years, are very often decisive for the placement of the orders. But suppliers from developing countries covered by the GSP and from countries with which the EU has concluded free trade agreements are also becoming increasingly important when the decision where to buy goods is to be made. Of course, one of the reasons to move sourcing to these countries is a duty-free import or an import with reduced customs duties into the EU. Especially the countries that fall under the Everything But Arms Agreement and thus guarantee duty-free imports into the EU are very interesting for importers. We are talking about countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Myanmar, or Laos. The countries that fall under the normal GSP should be considered somewhat more differentiated here. Examples for us are India and Indonesia. Due to the lower customs advantage, for example, 9.6% instead of 12% for clothing, especially for sensitive goods, and due to the sometimes quite strict list and origin rules, orders are often placed in other countries, here China. In particular, the textiles and clothing sector with the double tariff transformation, which means that not only the fabric, but also the yarn must have been produced in the country of preference. Many developing countries, for example, Vietnam, cannot offer this at present. From our point of view, a great relief for the importing companies was the introduction of the REC system in 2017. This means that formal certificates of origin Form A no longer have to be presented to the customs authorities for the customs clearance of importing goods from developing countries covered by the GSP. An invoice or other commercial document provided with an origin declaration specified in the REX regulation of the EU Commission is enough for duty-free or reduced duty imports into the EU. Furthermore, the document does not need to be signed, and the scanned copy is sufficient for presentation of customs at customs clearance. This results in cost savings for importers due to the elimination of courier shipments of the supply for the supply of the original certificate of origin Form A to the importers. To speak frankly, in order to make the best use of trade preferences, the internal organization needs to have a precise knowledge of the rules of origin and list rules set out in the relevant agreements. In many cases, this is from our point of view a reason for importers to forego the benefits of trade preferences. SMEs in particular do not have the manpower, the time, or the knowledge to familiarize themselves with the various free trade agreements of the regulations of the GSP. However, knowledge of these rules of origin is necessary in order to be able to prove the preferential origin of the goods during subsequent audits by the local customs authorities. Below is an example which reflects the problem well from our point of view. The example is a normal bicycle which fall under Customs Tariff Code 8712/0030. In case you want to import this bicycle from an everything but arms country, for example Bangladesh, in the list rules is mentioned factor in which the value of all materials used does not exceed 70% of the ex-works price of the product. In case of countries GSP Plus, for example, Philippines, or GSP, Indonesia, the list rule is mentioning manufacturer in which the value of the material used does not exceed 50% of the ex-works price of the product. When we then see, for example, the free trade agreement between the EU and South Korea, we found out that the list rule is manufacturer in which the value of all materials used does not exceed 45% of the ex-works price of the product. And finally, when we go to Morocco, then we found out in the list rules that it is mentioned manufacturer in which the value of all materials used does not exceed 30% of the ex-works price of the products. This is only one product, a bicycle. And from our point of view, this example shows very well how complex the topic of list rules and rules of origin can be. Therefore, you can easily see what challenges await importers here. Many wholesalers and retailers obtain a colorful bouquet of various goods from many different countries with preferential treatment. It is almost impossible to carry out a complete check of the agreements concluded between the EU and the countries of origin and to verify all the information provided by the suppliers. Another important point is the liability in case of incorrect documents for goods with preferential origin. In case the customs authorities should find out that the documents have been wrongly issued in the course of the examination of the documents during customs clearance, the customs authorities will directly contact the importer in order to reclaim the insufficient customs duties. Furthermore, the preference documents are re-examined by the General Customs Audit, which usually takes place every 3 years. If there are any discrepancies, import duties are also levied subsequently. In addition, the customs authorities may request a verification of the preferential document in the country of origin. For this purpose, the document is returned to the respective country of origin for verification of the legitimacy of the preference, and until the verification is finally clarified, customs duties must be deposited with the customs authorities in the form of security. All these points in a nutshell, from our point of view, Any importer should always be aware that the decision to buy goods in a preferential country is always accompanied by a certain risk. Herewith, I would like to close my remarks about trade preferences from the perspective of an importing company. I would like to say thank you for your interest and will of course be happy to answer any further questions you may have. With that, I will give the floor again to our moderator, Stuart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernd. It's clear that there are distinct advantages for importers, but it's also very clear that it's complicated, particularly with rules of origin. So I would like now to hand over to our next panelist, Anna Cavazzini. She's a German MEP working for or representing, I should say, the Greens and European Free Alliance. Anna, if you will, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for the event. Yeah, I guess all of you know, and I believe also Walter mentioned it at the beginning, that we are in the European Parliament waiting for the review of the GSP system. And I think this is also something I want to discuss today a little bit, what kind of things are working well and what kind of things we should probably improve in the upcoming review. And probably it would be also interesting to see from the Commission if there is already some thought about it. And also I saw that the proposal originally was supposed to come in the first quarter of 21, and now it's moved to the second quarter. Probably later Walter can also explain a little bit about the timing and about the thoughts of the Commission. In principle, I want to say that for me, the GSP system is really, and I think for a lot of MEPs who are active in the Trade Committee, the GSP system is really a little bit the embodiment of fair trade, because, yeah, it was mentioned it's value-based, but it's also following this differentiated approach that we as Greens always advocate. And this is, of course, also kind of UN and WTO principle. So, like, the poorer countries have a bit of getting a better chance than the richer countries because they are already more economically developed. And the GSP system, as you know, combines both approaches. And I think what is also important to mention again that, oh shit, sorry, I had some technical issues, but okay, that there is this combination of incentives, but also at the end of sanctions. And I mean, we're discussing this here very controversially all the time. We and other groups in the European Parliament demand also a sanctions-based approach for the TSD chapters in bilateral free trade agreements. But we see this basically sanctions-based approach already here. And I think there's also a lot of lessons being learned from that, if it's working or not. We have also just followed with a lot of interest the decision on Cambodia. And you always see also the upsides and downsides. I mean, I don't know. I have the feeling it will probably have some effect on the Cambodian government, but of course you can also see that, of course, it affects also people on the ground. And this is always, I think, the difficult decision probably to take. The case of the Philippines was already mentioned. You probably know that the European Parliament, I believe 4 weeks ago, in a resolution demanded the Commission to also take action on the GSP Plus system on the Philippines, because the situation of human rights is deteriorating on the grounds. But then it's always a difficult decision. I understand that. We have also seen some problems. It was mentioned, I believe, also by the Commission, but the European Parliament was very vocal on that in the last GSP resolution, that the diversification doesn't really work so well yet. So we still see this pattern of a lot of developing countries being a little bit, the raw material exporter or like the garment exporters, but it's not often also not really helping them to diversify the economy and to get a little bit away from this raw material exporter role. But of course, the question is what can be changed about that. But I think this is definitely one problem we are seeing at the moment. And although I like the statistics about the LDCs, that probably the EU is still the forerunner from LDC imports, we still see the numbers are very, very, very low. And of course, the idea would be also, okay, how can we probably even better promote the LDC inclusion in world trade. And then probably a last challenge I see that, I think sometimes we don't really see a lot of progress when you look at the individual workers' situation. I mean, it's of course not so easy, and I agree with Walter that the GSP system cannot solve all the problems of the world, absolutely not. But then sometimes we also see that the GSP system led to the fact that, for example, like in Cambodia, it was mainly sugarcane exporters, big companies who profited from that. But did it really end up at the end at the workers? And this is the big question. So probably like very quickly some food of thought from my side on the solutions. In general, I would say the GSP system can only be seen as a kind of in a connection with the planned due diligence legislation, because I think one aspect is, of course, trade preferences, but the other aspect is also improving the liability or improving the due diligence and the risk-based approach along the entire supply chain. And I think we are on a good way at the moment in the European Union, but I still wanted to make that point. I also know that Amfori is a supporter of that, so that's good. But as you also know, it will be a difficult discussion. We're seeing it now in the parliament when we talk about the details. It's sometimes tough discussions on how a due diligence legislation should be really designed. And I just also want to make the point here that it's, for me, crucial to have a strong due diligence legislation next to a strong GSP system. And I think it's kind of a twin thing. Then I think we need to look how to align the GSP system a little bit better with the Green Deal. And I mentioned it already at several events, and it was already in the Parliament resolution, but I want to make the point again that probably some of the conventions need to be updated, for example, the Paris Agreement and so on. And I wonder if it would also make sense to include something with a living wage in it, because I think the main problem is, as I said, that all the benefits don't trickle down to the workers. And I don't know if we could use the GSP system to also really improve the living wage or to have a kind of overall living wage framework for those countries. But this is something to discuss. And then I think what is important to have a little bit more like transparency and inclusion of stakeholders, be it civil society, but probably also industry people, I don't know, on when on the different stages of escalation in the GSP system. So when do we actually decide that preferences are withdrawn? Also, as a parliamentarian, I can say that we don't really, I have the feeling I'm not really involved in this discussion either. Probably it's also not for us, but I think in general it's good to have a more inclusive mechanism and transparent mechanism on who takes which decision when, and like how are different, can, for example, NGOs who really see a lot of problems on the ground also notify to the Commission, or trade unions, can they kind of also trigger this discussion about it? And I think this needs to be improved. And the last thing or last idea I want to bring in, what I see is often a little bit problematic is when GSP countries graduate, and then we have often the situation that they're forced in FTAs. You know, we Greens are very critical of the EPAs, for example, the economic partnership agreements with African countries, and we are especially critical because we see it destroys a regional integration, and you have some countries that graduated from the GSP status, and then from one day to the other will lose all the preferences. So they're kind of forced in an FTA and then other countries in the region are still having the preferences. So what does it do to regional integration? And I think for me, it should be really the EU goal to foster regional integration, especially in Africa, and also work towards this pan-European, pan-African free trade zone in order to strengthen the regional economy. So these are some of my thoughts. And as I said, I think it would be good if the Commission probably also can say something a little bit on what is really planned so far for this review, because I think this is where we have the chance to try to get rid of some of the problems we see. But I would also say, agree, overall it is a very good system, and clearly my group, and I think all the other groups in the European Parliament are really supporters of the general system, which is not the case with all trade instruments, for us at least.
Great, thank you, Anna. I think if we were to discuss all the points you raised, we would be here for another couple of hours, which we don't have, which is a shame because you put forward some very interesting ideas. Just to briefly mention that when the Commission did the investigation against Cambodia, there were a number of NGOs and people involved in the hearing process, including Amphori, and so it was possible to submit thoughts, but indeed more transparency would be good. And I would like to move on now because I think some of the things you mentioned, particularly some of the problems countries are facing and the issues felt by the actual workers rather than the government, will be dealt with in more detail by Claudio. Claudio Francavilla represents Human Rights Watch, and I know he's going to touch on some of these specific problems with human rights in a few different countries. So Claudio, if you will, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to Stuart and Amphori for inviting us and giving us this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. I will add to what indeed the previous speakers have mentioned concerning the human rights dimension and the human rights conditionality of the GSP scheme. And I will also flag on that note that Human Rights Watch did submit his series of recommendations to the Commission in the public consultations that were launched earlier this year, and I hope those are publicly available, but if they aren't, maybe we can find a way to share them with everyone who is interested. Indeed, we put forward 17 recommendations for the GSP regulation reform. And many of those touch upon some of the topics that Anna mentioned already, including civil society participation in the process, increased transparency, increased flexibility from the parts of the EU. Plus one of the other recommendations I will touch upon in a second, and it deals with one fundamental difference that the GSP scheme has between the GSP plus beneficiaries on the one hand and the EBA and standard GSP beneficiaries on the other. The EBA and standard GSP beneficiaries have what is called negative conditionality, meaning that the trade benefits can be withdrawn in case of serious and systematic violations of the principles laid down in certain core human rights and labor conventions that are listed in the regulation. Whereas GSP plus beneficiaries, they undertake to ratify and fully implement 27 human rights, labor rights, and environmental conventions, and they allow the EU to closely monitor their implementation record. So it goes without saying that the GSP plus positive conditionality scheme is a much stronger tool to ensure adherence to the international standards. And one of the recommendations indeed that we put forward was to extend the positive conditionality scheme to also the EBA and the standard GSP beneficiaries. Secondly, one of the things that were mentioned earlier as well is that the GSP is not the only tool that the EU has when it comes to reacting to human rights violations around the world. You have many more. You have targeted sanctions. You have action at the UN, efforts towards accountability statements, trial, observation, support to civil society, etc., etc. You have guidelines on human rights. You have a whole EU action plan on human rights and democracy, which should be adopted soon. So there are a lot of actions that the EU can take. So we cannot say that when there are some serious human rights violations going on in one GSP beneficiary country, and the EU does not automatically trigger the withdrawal procedure of the GSP, that the EU is doing nothing on that country. We have to look at maybe some other tools being employed from the EU. However, there is a key difference between those tools that I mentioned earlier and the GSP, which is that the GSP is a piece of law. The GSP is a legal instrument, is a regulation that sets out certain requirements to enjoy the trade benefits and certain conditions for the withdrawal of those trade benefits. And the beneficiary countries know that. They know about this. They know that the trade benefits that they receive come with conditions attached, and they know that they can be withdrawn. Also, the European Commission, on the other hand, knows that the margin of discretion that they have to determine whether it is necessary to withdraw the preferences can only be stretched up to a certain point. And the Commission arguably has been very careful to trigger the withdrawal procedures. It has happened only 4 times in over 20 years. The latest one is Cambodia, which has seen its trade preferences partly withdrawn in August this year. This was due to a serious crisis in Cambodia that there was a major backtracking in Cambodia's human rights record in 2017 when Hun Sen felt that he could lose power given the elections that were coming the following year and the growing popularity of the opposition. So he dissolved the main opposition party and he turned Cambodia into a de facto one-party state. The EU reacted immediately. They put the EBA on the table and they undertook the enhanced engagement with Cambodia. They threatened repeatedly that there would be consequences. And 3 years later, it was proven that Hun Sen was more willing to keep his power than to face the economic consequences of the withdrawal, and he left the EU with no other choice than to withdraw the trade preferences this year. There are other countries that are under enhanced engagement. Those include Bangladesh, which is the biggest beneficiary from the EBA scheme, and so the EU has quite some leverage with the country. And another one is Myanmar, of course, which is perhaps the most dramatic situation. The acts probably constituted crimes against humanity, against the Rohingya people, led to a major humanitarian crisis as well. And indeed, many of the refugees are currently hosted by Bangladesh, which is also under enhanced engagement. So quite a headache for the EU to deal with this. But if you look at the GSP plus beneficiaries, which, as I said, has much stronger conditions attached, you find countries like the Philippines that are under preliminary examination from the International Criminal Court for the crimes committed in the context of the so-called war on drugs that has led to probably tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings, plus a wide range of other violations that have happened in the country. And indeed, as was mentioned, the European Parliament just a few weeks ago called for the Commission to take action on the GSP plus angle as well. And you have Sri Lanka, which is in fact one of the 4 countries that has seen the GSP preferences withdrawn in the past. Since they were reinstated, there has been some very timid progress. Sri Lanka has always been a country, let's say, on the edge of the respect of the GSP convention, and this is to be very broad and generous. But the new government that is recently to power, it is undoing all the timid progress that was achieved, and indeed has publicly announced that it will not cooperate with the UN Human Rights Council anymore. I'm oversimplifying it. I'm happy to go into details afterwards. Then you also have Uzbekistan, who just applied for the GSP Plus status in June. The Commission is to take a preliminary decision on whether to greenlight this or not in the coming weeks. Uzbekistan has been for decades one of the countries with the world's worst human rights records. So the baseline was very low, and in the past few years there has been some progress, but again the progress has been against a very low baseline, and you have recent reports from the UN, from UN bodies that talk about some outstanding issues like torture, like political prisoners, restrictions to media and civil society, etc. So again, one other country with questionable human rights record, major deficiencies, and difficult decision to be taken by the Commission. Now, this perhaps is a short overview of some of the countries that are among the beneficiaries and some criticalities that exist there. The GSP scheme, however, is meant to be as an incentive. So it's not granted to be withdrawn. It's granted to be kept and to promote progress in the beneficiary countries. But on the other hand, the credibility of the system itself depends on the capacity from the Commission to react when serious human rights violations occur. The governments need to know that the prospect of facing consequences is concrete. And I want to conclude with just two observations. One concerns a certain tendency that we have seen in the GSP assessment from the Commission, which is to focus more on the labor rights than on the civil and political rights. And this is problematic because it counters the concept of indivisibility. You need both. What I mean is that you do need to improve the labor conditions of people. This is of course very important, but you also need freedom of association, independent trade unions, an independent judiciary that people can revert to if they feel that their rights are being violated, independent media and civil society to monitor the implementation of the commitments, to expose any instances of wrongdoing. You need political freedom to campaign and bring forward reforms, etc., etc. So civil and political rights and labor rights are not parallel. They have to go hand in hand, and the Commission should take a close look at both. And the final point I want to make is on the role of businesses. We understand that the businesses are not, of course, per se necessarily human rights activists. They are they're businesses. They care about the investments that they have made. They care about the economic consequences that they themselves can face if preferences, GSP preferences, are withdrawn from a country. But when you see some negative trends going on in a country and you understand that the GSP benefits may be at risk, you have basically two options. One is to lobby the Commission to leave the government alone and to close an eye on these violations that are taking place in the country. The other one is instead to echo the concerns that are made by the Commission, by the UN, by civil society, and to tell the government, the institutions you are in contact with and who are interested in your voice, because of course you bring business and money, to that it's better to backtrack, it's better to deliver on the implementation of the convention. And this is indeed the best way to avoid and to prevent the withdrawal of the GSP benefits. It's a win-win situation. We have seen businesses taking both approaches. We would like to see the businesses only take the second approach and to echo the concerns and to join if you want the lobbying movement towards the government to respect the rights of its own people. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Claudio. You raised some very interesting points there. At this point, I would just like to remind the participants who are listening into this webinar that you can ask questions. It's on the right-hand side of the screen. So please do so if you wish to pose any questions to the panel or the individual panelists. I would just like to introduce Amfori's position on GSP and on trade preferences. As already indicated, we're representing importers, and so the benefits, the trade preferences are very important to us, but we're also very much in favor of sustainable trade and sustainable supply chains. In one of Walter's slides, you may have quickly seen on the wall the Amfori BSCI Code of Conduct, and that commits our members and their suppliers in third countries to a number of policies such as freedom of association, collective bargaining, fair remuneration, and of course no child labour. And because of those are based on the core ILO and UN conventions, and so we strongly advocate for strong TSD chapters in FTAs and that the EU monitors the compliance by those countries. And we support that the GSP countries live up to the commitments to the 27 ILO and UN conventions that Claudio referred to, and also that the EU monitors that compliance. And that is actually why we supported the recent action by the EU on Cambodia. And on a number of occasions, we've spoken out against the lack of progress in other countries. Of course, as Anna mentioned, there can be an effect on the actual workers and people, perhaps not so much the government, when the Commission does take action after an Article 19 investigation and decides to withdraw preferences. And I think that is why, as Claudio mentioned, it's only done so in 4 circumstances and that is as a last resort. And so although we support that action, we also have to recognize that there needs to be done in a very careful way. And one other thing, just to give an example of some of the work that we try to do in certain countries to help those countries develop, we have partnered with SEQUA, also the Center of Economic and Social Development for Myanmar, and the Confederation of Trade Unions in Myanmar in an EU-funded project called the Smart Textiles and Garment Project. And what this does, it tries to improve the conditions of garment workers specifically, to promote better work and environmental standards and reduce the violations of workers' rights in that industry through capacity building and training producers and relevant stakeholders to improve the situation. Although, of course, in Myanmar in particular, the situation is particularly bad. So I'm now looking to see if there are any questions. I see one. If you just excuse me a moment.
Stuart, do you want us to respond to some of the points made? Or?
Perhaps you could, Walter, very briefly. I know there were a couple of points Anna made that you wanted to come back to, and whilst you're doing that, I'll have a look at the questions I received.
No, because I mean, I appreciate her intervention very much, as well as the other colleagues, and you have all good points. I mean, just on Bernd's point, I think the least developed countries have more preferential rules of origin than the other countries, but it's especially because of the point that MEP Cavazzini made, is of course we want the LDCs to be able to export more to the EU. So point taken that 2.1% is still fairly low, and I think we need to work on seeing how we can further increase that with whatever means we have. But I think we should also be proud as an EU that we actually give double the efforts that some of the other big countries in the world are doing. On the next regulation, the review is ongoing. There was a public consultation, which we got many contributions in a lot of directions, but we also got the feedback from a midterm evaluation that our current regulation was kind of a good thing. Huh? So we need to get more leverage. I fully agree with the point made by MEP Cavazzini, and I think we look very much forward working further together with the Parliament on seeing how we can use that. But I think the essence is always kind of how can you focus your trade agenda in a way that you can actually have that leverage. And the outcome of Cambodia is something to be followed very closely, because there we did take that kind of dramatic step of a withdrawal, and we do hope that that will help to further reforms. In the meantime, by working closely with civil society, Human Rights Watch, but also the European Parliament, the European External Action Service, we are already able to have quite a leverage on, for instance, the death penalty. If I tell you that Sri Lanka, Mongolia, they were actually hesitant to reintroduce death penalty, but then when they actually analyzed that this would actually be against one of the conventions, the ICCPR, that they committed to, some of the stakeholders within those countries advocated against it, and the same case in the Philippines. I don't know if that's response. I mean, you had a lot of points, and I agree we should have a longer time for this, but as a first feedback from my side.
Thank you, Walter. We received a couple of questions. One is perhaps for you, actually. Has there been any change in the utilization rates of GSP plus EBA since the outbreak of Corona?
Well, what we see, so the overall trade figures are dropping quite significantly because a lot of these trade is in textiles and garments, and Stuart, you know very well that the supply chains, they basically came to a stop. And also the demand in Europe and the US reduced quite a lot. So we see a dramatic impact in a country like Bangladesh, where the imports reduced by 40%. At the same time, if you look at the longer trend, you ask utilization rate is still going up. So I showed in one of my slides that our utilization rate went up to 84.5%, which is quite a good achievement. In terms of where we came from a couple of years ago, and it's thanks to a lot of awareness raising, working on the rules of origin, the point that Bernd made, where we can still make further steps, as well as, for instance, using our trade-related assistance to help countries actually to take advantage of these preferences. But the COVID-19 has a dramatic impact. Let's not, that's for sure.
Right, thank you very much, Walter. I'm very wary of the time. We have 2 minutes left already, and we need to finish on time. So I think we have no more questions, so I will take the opportunity just to perhaps come back on a couple of points that Anna made, also Claudio, about the effect on workers. I do see that perhaps a living wage could be integrated into the GSP system, and that is something when the system is reformed could be looked at. I do see that it's not necessarily that the living wage goes up when orders and production goes up in those countries as a direct result of GSP. One point that Claudio made about the political aspects or the civil aspects of withdrawing of preferences, I think in Cambodia, the main argument for why the Commission withdrew preferences was, as you said, because the elections were not free and fair, or at least you were free and fair to vote for one candidate only. And I'm also very concerned about the apparent lack of progress from Sri Lanka now that it has received a GSP plus. I don't know what the update is on Bangladesh, but the enhanced cooperation or enhanced engagement that the Commission has done was slightly stalled, but mainly because of COVID. So there are many issues that can be discussed, and I think that the review of GSP will be very interesting, and I'd like to stay in touch particularly with Anna Cavazzini and also you, Claudio, to perhaps come forward with some suggestions. So with 1 minute left, I would like to thank all of our panelists today. I'm sorry that there wasn't perhaps another 1 or 2 hours to discuss, but such is the way of things. So thank you very much to Anna Cavazzini, Bernd Schaefer, Claudio Francavilla, Walter, if you are still there, thank you very much also. And thank you for all the participants for listening in today. The session has been recorded, so I assume that it will be available for later reference. And Walter, your slides are available as well, I suggest.
Perfect. Thanks.
Very good. Okay, thank you everyone again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.